I'm so glad to be back again with all of you here today. And we're very fortunate because we have Mitchell Consky on with us. He's a journalist and an author, and he really specializes in features about loss and travel, adventure, and current events, I think, too. He's written a pivotal book about loss from a very unique perspective that's going to help a lot of people going through losing a loved one, but in particular, losing a loved one while going through a very tough time, like a collective trauma, like COVID-19. And, it's interesting because Mitchell is able to really understand what it's like to be embedded in deep family loss while you're going through something that everybody is struggling with. So we're going to get an opportunity to hear a little bit about Home Safe, a memoir of end of life care during COVID-19. But the interesting thing about this book, and I know it happened during COVID-19, but to me, it just seems like a book about a time where you're losing somebody you really love and also facing tough times collectively in the world around you. And I think it's not unusual to be going through that. Doesn't have to be COVID-19. There are a lot of collective traumas, and we're facing things like that right now at this point in time with a number of wars going on in the world and a lot of emotional confusion that people are experiencing in general. So thank you so much, Mitchell, for joining us today. And we appreciate you being here.
Anna, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Fantastic. I know that you chose journalism, and I was thinking about how tough journalism is, and how sometimes people who are doing this important work of sharing truth and information can also experience a lot of strain and trouble in their own life as a result of sharing what is true, of being part of the truth tellers in the world is not exactly an easy thing to do at this particular juncture in time. So first of all, why don't you just tell us a little bit about what took you down the road? What were your inspirations in becoming a journalist?
Yeah, for sure. So I started as a journalist for the student newspaper. I went to Wilfrid Laurier University. I first started doing opinion columns, and then I started doing feature articles for them. But I think what really was the catalyst for me deciding to sort of go down this route was losing a best friend in a motorcycle accident. So when I was 19 years old, one of my best friends died in a motorcycle accident. He was doing a co-op term in California. And right after it happened, I sort of felt this urgency to sort of capture what we lost. I wanted to immortalize him in some way. And my best friend Gabby had a twin sister, Sabrina, and every single night I would send her stories about her brother. And that sort of evolved into me interviewing some of his friends and capturing all these little anecdotes about, Gabby getting into his first bar with a fake ID, or, his first kiss, or all these little moments. And I guess my first entrance into journalism was trying to sort of resurrect a lost friend through words on a page and through stories, and that kind of evolved into other forms of journalism, and I developed this passion for speaking to people, and hearing about really difficult moments, but also finding the therapy in that. And I think that's something that's interesting between both psychologists and journalists, is that you ultimately develop this therapeutic relationship between the subject that you're speaking to. People find such relief and therapy in telling their story, and I think that's something that my book really does focus on. And I think it's that relationship that I've always been most interested in, and that I like to explore with my work for sure.
Yeah, I agree. It actually is a lot about the narrative and a lot about kind of bringing yourself into your world and making sense of what has happened to you. And there's something really therapeutic about being able to just share in a safe way, in a way that lets us take those fragments of what we've experienced in life and kind of make sense of them and put them into a coherent storyline. And I
Right.
do think there is something really powerful about storytelling. It's not a very easy thing to do when it's
Mhm.
your own story, though. And you have brought that forward with Home Safe, and you not only exposed your own experience, but you talked about what was happening in your family
Mhm.
during a really, really troubling time, during a time that just, I think, from reading the book, it really sounds like there were moments that were so heart-wrenching. And yet I always had this feeling as I was reading it that there was something sweet about the kindness in your family and the willingness of your family to really be really, really present with
Right.
these really tough things. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things about this experience is that we had the luxury of time, which I think outside of the context of a global pandemic, it's really easy to surrender to the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Everything is moving very quickly, and it's rare to have those moments where everything can completely stop. And that's what the pandemic sort of afforded us. Despite the subtitle of my book, my dad didn't die of COVID-19. He was dying of stage 4 cancer during the onset of the pandemic. And so because of that, you know, we didn't have to say goodbye to him behind a pixelated Zoom screen, when he was masked up in an isolated hospital wing, like so many other people had to experience during the pandemic. So we had this rare opportunity to spend all these final moments together. And that was this incredible blessing. We binge watched Tiger King. We had all these final conversations about life and death. And I audio recorded him throughout his decline. And that hat that I tried on, that journalist hat that I tried on when I was 19 years old, interviewing the friends of my friend who died in a motorcycle accident, that hat came back on. And it was the same urgency, that the desire to immortalize what I knew I was losing. But because of that, we were able to have a lot of important conversations that I don't think we would have been able to otherwise. My sister moved back into the house. I abandoned my Toronto apartment. I moved into my parents' house. And it was our first time in almost 7 years that my whole immediate family was living together under the same roof. And we had pajama dance parties. As I said, we binge watched Tiger King. We kind of were able to sort of lean into this type of presence and togetherness that I don't think we would have been able to, if it wasn't for the pandemic. And you're right, there was this sweetness to all of it. And I think it was the opportunity to recognize that we're not all going to have this moment forever, but we get to live completely in that moment right then. And that came through with the conversations that we had and the stories we told, and all these beautiful moments that sort of dovetailed our grief and our despair.
Can we go back for a minute to that first experience that you described with Gabby? He had a motorcycle accident, and it just sounds like that was just a shocking starting point for you, where you
Right.
recognized there was something about writing
Mhm.
that was transformative.
Yes, I think it. I noticed this in my dad too, and I think it's very relevant to my experience writing about Gabby, and the idea is that um, my dad lost both of his parents when he was really young. He lost his mom when he was 15, and he lost his dad when he was 22, and he never really spoke about them until he was dying himself. So in a way, it's almost like he lost them twice. He lost them physically, but then he also wasn't really able to share and preserve the memory of them and pass that memory on to us. And I remember thinking about that after I lost Gabby, and kind of being feeling this urgency to tell those stories and to maintain those relationships. And that really was one of the emerging factors in these conversations. I got to understand my dad's past. I got to understand my grandparents in ways that I don't think I really would have been able to. In my dad reconciling his own grief, he was also able to confront his own mortality. And I think there's something really special about that. It makes, I don't know, I've done a lot of research on legacy palliative care, which is a branch of palliative care where patients really focus on telling their stories, and that can come across in memory boxes and putting items in a box. It can come across in recordings. It can come across in writing, whatever it really is. But there's so much relief that can be found in articulating that legacy, in bringing that legacy forward. And all of that sort of, I didn't know the term legacy palliative care at the time, but looking back, that's exactly what it was. And not only did it help my father and help me connect with him in ways that I don't think I would have been able to elsewhere or ever before, but it really did, um, it helped my whole family, and we were able to really um, have a lot of conversations that I don't think we would have been able to. And we were able to understand a lot of the trauma that I don't think we were able to address prior.
And you kind of stumbled upon it, like nobody said, you know, uh, legacy palliative care to you, but
Mm,
somehow you stumbled upon it in this cocooning state during COVID,
mm.
where everybody was living together, and you kind of created it out of intuition, out of what?
I think I was afraid of losing his voice. I was afraid of not getting all the answers that I possibly could. My mom has these recordings that she's been showing us for years growing up, of her father interviewing my mom as a little kid, at a they went to a family's bar mitzvah, and I hear my grandfather interviewing everybody, all the little kids, and I get to hear my mom as a little girl, but I also got to hear the voice of my grandfather. And I would never have been able to do that if it wasn't for those recordings. And I think that definitely planted a seed in my mind where I didn't know that this was going to turn into a book, but I knew that I wanted to capture his voice. I needed to gain, some tangible piece of him that I wasn't going to get afterwards. And I wrote a list of all the questions that I could have asked, all the questions that I never asked before. Some of them were sort of elementary school uh, territories, such as like, what's your favorite color and when did you have your first kiss? And then some of them were a lot more complex, like, do you believe in God and are you afraid of dying? And what did it feel like when your mother died? And there's all of these conversations that I don't think we typically have, when we're healthy and when life feels like it's not gonna end. And that was this it was this wake up call. And you're right, I didn't really know what legacy palliative care was, but I knew that I wanted to capture his legacy before it was too late. And I think that's what motivated all of this.
So, you know, from a psychological perspective, it's really, really interesting because the reality is most of us don't move deeply into our relationships. We keep them on a level because it feels safer, and we feel at risk, and we don't want to either get too close because we don't want to be seen, or we don't want to reveal something, or the other person is tense and doesn't want to reveal something. So we stay in these very superficial but not very satisfying places in our connections, and then we suffer for it because we all do a lot better when we have this deepening of connection. And it sounds like that happened for you and your family. You had this deepening, this enriched experience that was, it sounds like it was unexpected, but intentional.
Right. Yeah. I think it was intentional, and I didn't know the extent of it at the time. As I said, I knew that I needed to write something after I gathered these interviews, or audio recorded these interviews, and I had been keeping a journal throughout all of it. But I don't know. I think it's yeah. There was this therapy that arrived with all of it, and I'm grateful. I'm grateful that I had the time to have these conversations. And I think the reason that people are afraid to have these conversations is because we live in such a grief illiterate society, and we don't like talking about death, and we don't like having these really difficult discussions about loss and grief and death. And I think that when we allow ourselves to go there, it opens up connection that you can't really access otherwise. I volunteer at this grief camp called Camp Air in Toronto. I'm going to plug it very briefly because it's relevant. And it's this grief camp for kids between the ages of 5 and 16 who have all lost a parent or sibling. There's a Camp Aaron in every city that has a major league baseball team throughout North America. And the reason that that's so relevant here is because it's a rare space where kids get to be kids. They get to run around, paddle canoes, climb the rock climbing wall, jump into the water for polar bear dip, while also being surrounded by, you know, grief experts, psychologists, social workers, um, qualified experts that can walk them through these really difficult discussions about grief and loss and death and dying. And one of the things that was so apparent during my time volunteering there is that they teach adults to sort of lean into these really difficult discussions about grief. We tend to shield children from talking about this stuff. And therefore kids learn to bottle it up. And when they grow older, they're not really willing to have these really difficult conversations. And a perfect example was my own father, going most of my life without really talking about his parents because he had been taught that he's not supposed to talk about these really difficult things. Um, so I think that the message of my book, what I want to get across more than anything, is the idea that we can talk about these really difficult things, and when we do, it's going to open up connection that you can't really possibly access in a different context.
That's really profound because I can tell you I've worked with many people who've had the experience of losing somebody they were close to as children, and nobody wanting to talk to them. They were basically left to sit on their own, or told not to play, or because they were supposed to be serious, and
Right,
being reprimanded if they what a normal child will do
right,
when they are grieving is actually also mix that grieving with playtime and
exactly. Yeah,
activity, and they need that outlet. I mean, it's not healthy for them to just sit and hold their pain.
right,
Yet a lot of people will not talk to children about what they're feeling, especially if they're also grieving, because it's so heart-wrenching. So the
right,
fact that Camp Aaron exists is pretty remarkable. And I'm sure there are a lot of kids that get a lot of relief from that, because what I hear from kids who grow up to be adults and they go through something like this, nobody talking to them after either the death of a parent or the death of somebody they loved or somebody they were close to, a grandparent, a family friend, whoever it is nobody cared about me, and I'm not allowed to talk about my pain. And
right,
they carry that into adulthood, and it's really dangerous, because what ends up happening is we develop a lot of rigidity around our emotional pain, rather than having a kind of friendlier relationship with our feelings, our pain, our emotions. It's like you can lean into that stuff, and
right,
if you're going to be really kind to yourself, there's a place where you can just be spacious and accepting about the pain that you're experiencing. And when kids don't get that, what they learn to do is either literally shut it down. So it's like, I got a brain, but I'm
right,
not going to feel anything that I'm feeling in my heart or my body.
exactly.
And and if it does slip out, I'm ashamed, and I have to
Right,
apologize to you for
right,
doing that.
right. Yeah. It becomes an entire blunting out of emotions. You might not feel, when you kind of you mute all those feelings, you might not feel the intensity of the despair and the grief, but then you also won't feel the joy and the happiness as well. Andrea Warnick, she's a grief psychologist that I interviewed for a piece I wrote on the Walrus called Notes from Grief Camp, and she spoke about this phenomenon called like puddle jumping, and the idea is that kids can sort of jump in and out of their grief as if they're jumping in and out of puddles. And when they're in it, it's big and it's debilitating like the ocean. But then they sort of jump out and they're able to have fun and they're able to laugh and run around. And I think that's a model that adults can actually learn from. When adults look at grief, especially adults that have been raised to believe that they have to bottle it up and not talk about it, um, it becomes sort of this black hole where they feel that if they allow themselves to jump into that puddle, they'll never be able to get out. And so, a major part of this seems to be allowing people to understand that it's okay to go there. You're not going to get stuck. And in fact, sometimes refusing to jump into that puddle becomes the trap. That becomes
Mhm.
what locks you out of feeling all the joy and all the stuff on the other side of the emotional spectrum that you want to feel. Uh, so yeah, it's extremely interesting how we can be conditioned early on that on how we're supposed to experience grief, and then it becomes this chain reaction of reinforcing that narrative. As kids, if we're told we can't talk about these really difficult feelings, we're going to also sort of create that model for our kids, and it becomes this paradox. It becomes this cycle of sort of
So wait a
blunting the
minute, wait a
feelings.
minute. Are you
Yeah,
saying to me that, I mean, I knew your father,
yeah,
and he was a really lovely man. And the thing that I remember, one of the stories, I'm going to tell you a story,
yeah,
okay?
yeah.
One of the stories that I remember of your father was he actually, we actually had some mutual clients.
Right,
So, you know, the thing that blew me away with your dad was that he deeply, deeply cared about the clients that he was working with. He wanted
right.
them to have the best
Yeah,
outcome. He had so much integrity.
yeah.
He was so dedicated to make sure that, the right thing happened. Like
Right.
he went to the ends. It
100%.
Yeah, and I remember him sharing one case. I'm not going to go into the details about it, but what kind of really impressed me was just how deeply passionate he felt about making sure that this one client had a good outcome, and how much that meant to him,
Right.
and it was such a nice thing to hear. It was like
Yeah.
so much effort made in the care of another person.
Right.
That going the distance was
Right.
not too much for him.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and that's undeniable. My dad cared immensely about other people. I would say that he was too selfless. I would say that he cared more about helping other people than addressing his own feelings. And that's, I don't know if that was a result of his own suppressed grief. I don't know if there was, uh, but I know that he wanted to do good, and he cared so much about other people. When he was, I write about this in my book. When he had less than a few weeks to live, he just got out of the hospital. He was wheeled into the hospital. He could barely sit in the same spot for more than you know 15 minutes prior to this moment. But for one moment, when he came back, he settled a case on Zoom, a law case on Zoom to help one of his clients who suffered severe brain trauma from a motor accident. And he sat there, for maybe 2.5 hours, despite the fact that he had less than a few weeks to live. He cared so much about other people. And I think it was I think it was his moral compass that made him so charming, and the fact that he did the same care, the same selflessness. He applied it to everybody else, and everybody else in our family, and it wasn't just his clients, it wasn't just his work. It was all of us, and
Mm,
um,
it's really
and yeah, it was it
You
was really
know,
beautiful.
what occurs to me is that you in this generation, you changed a pattern, because one of the things that you told me was that his mom died when he was 15, and his father died when he was 22. You wrote about this in the book as well.
Yeah,
But I think what maybe you didn't cover fully is how that was really handled, and how he, in a way, was one of those children who really, I mean, he wasn't a child really, but at 15, yes, at 22, no, but he had
yeah,
so many losses in such a short period of time, and such significant ones.
right,
And maybe he didn't get a chance to really grieve those in a way that would have
yeah,
been helpful for him, or come
yeah,
to terms with it, or to have somebody to talk to in a way
yeah,
that was really helpful, because I was thinking about your legacy palliative care, which you were sharing the concept. And then the first place that I go to is, what if there's nobody to listen? And now I'm thinking about your dad. I mean, all
Yeah.
these other people, because it's not that common. In fact, people die without telling their stories all the time.
Right.
And they're not always surrounded by this kind of open willingness. This is why this is such a great topic. Psychologically, it's such a great topic, because this is exactly how you can carry pain to the next and the next generation. But you guys didn't do that. You embraced him and embraced your own emotion and let yourself speak truth to all of this. Like, how did you make that happen? I mean, most families would just say, Mitchell, forget it.
Hmm. It wasn't easy, but I'm a stubborn journalist, I guess, and I wanted, I was afraid, I guess, and I think that's the answer. I was afraid of losing him. I was afraid of not having the pieces, and I think, you know, it does go back to losing my friend in that motorcycle accident. After I lost him, I remember wishing that I could have interviewed him the way that I'm interviewing all of his friends, and I couldn't do that for Gabby, but I realized early on that I could do that for my dad, and I also knew that if I wanted to do this right, I couldn't hold back. I needed to ask the questions that I was afraid to ask, because the consequence is never having those answers. And that was difficult. What could you ask a dying father that you would want to ask um, at a certain point in the future when you can't? And that was, I don't know. I guess the answer is that there was just a lot of urgency, and I felt like I needed to do this. And because of that, we also had the luxury of everything slowing down and us being inside this house and not having anywhere else to go. And so all of it kind of created this recipe for the family togetherness that was required to have those conversations.
Which is nonetheless really incredibly remarkable. And it kind of takes me back to this whole concept of how difficult it is to really share honestly, and to share stories that are not easy stories to tell. And
Mhm.
that is actually what you did with your family. So how did you convince your family that you were going to share this story?
It started with a Globe and Mail essay that I wrote. It was published Father's Day. I wrote it a few weeks before, and I reached out to this editor of the Globe and Mail, and she said, I would love to post this in a few months. And I said, actually, no, I would prefer that you post this a little bit earlier, because I don't know how much time. And it was a very simple story about my father always waiting for me at the top of the stairs. Growing up, no matter how old I got, when I was visiting back from university or back from a bar, my dad would always be waiting for me at the top of the stairs. He'd be standing there slouching in his boxers, his eyes groggy, and I'd always ask him, I'd say, Dad, what are you doing up? And he'd say, I just wanted to make sure you were home safe. And I remembered, as a night halfway through, his decline, he had just had a treatment. He had difficulty going to the bathroom himself, getting out of bed alone. And I remember coming home late one night after just, a walk to clear my head. And I remember really hoping to see him there at the top of those stairs. And of course he wasn't. And I walked up, and I guess I kind of just wanted one more moment where he was the father and I was the son, and I walked to the end of my room, and I got under the covers, and my emotions were competing, right? Because a part of me felt grateful that I had a father for all those years who cared for me in that way. And then a part of me felt terrified that I would never have a father, or that I would never have someone that would care for me like that again. And as I'm having all these thoughts, a bar of light glowed beneath my door, and I heard a floorboard groan. And my immediate instinct was, okay, he has to go to the bathroom. And it was actually my sister's turn to check on him at that point. We'd been alternating every night to make sure that we can actually get some good sleep during this end of life care process. And I remember throwing off the covers and thinking, you know what, I'm going to go check on him the way that he always checked on me. I opened up the door, and sure enough, there he is standing in his boxers. And he said, I just wanted to make sure you were home safe. And I gave him this big hug. And I guess it was this reminder that, you know, the person that I'm losing isn't yet totally gone. I wrote an essay that basically told that exact story, uh, and there was this wave of responses from Canadians all over that were experiencing very similar battles of loss and grief and reconciling what it means to lose a loved one. And that story became healing to people. It became healing to people in my own family, and there was this relief that came with immortalizing just this singular moment in my father's cancer journey. After that essay, it became clear that there is potential for something bigger here, and I spoke to my family about it, and it was, it wasn't easy. It was a daunting process of interviewing family members and
Yeah.
making sure that they were satisfied with certain depictions, and taking notes, and every single sentence was carefully assessed, because we wanted to make sure that it was as accurate, but also as emotionally tolerant as possible. And uh I'm proud of what resulted. And I think that the thing with this story is that it's unremarkable, and I don't mean that in the sense of it being insignificant. I mean in the sense that it's so universal, and that there's so many people that have experienced very similar battles, and it's particularly the role reversal that emerges when a son or child has to take care of a parent, but also when a spouse has to take care of another spouse, or a daughter has to take care of a father, or a sibling has to take care of another sibling. Um, so I think that to answer your question, that the reason that my family got behind this book is because we realized that this story is bigger than just us. And I think that more stories like this should be told. And I think that there's great relief when we could capture these singular moments that mean so much more than they might initially appear.
Hmm. That's really beautiful. I'm going to play something, and I
Yeah.
want to play a little bit of it, and maybe you can just tell me what this reminds you of. Can you hear?
Yep. Oh wait, no, I can't. I can't hear anything.
Oh, that's unfortunate. Okay, well, I'm not going to be able to play it because
Okay.
I'm inept at getting this to
Yeah.
go on live.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to tell you it's a Dispatch, Elias from Silent Steeples, and it's a
Yeah.
drumming kind of uh,
Yeah.
piece of music that's very dynamic.
Yeah.
And you know what I'm talking about right away. So maybe
Yeah.
you can tell me a little bit about how music played into this storyline, because I think music is a pretty powerful way of people kind of dealing with their emotions as well.
Absolutely. So I was the driver for my dad. I took him to all of his oncology appointments at Sunnybrook Hospital in Toronto, and I had a lot of time in the parking lot to think and write and try to distract myself as much as possible. During my dad's first oncology appointment, I remember waiting there for a few hours, and we didn't really know what to expect, and we also didn't really know the extent of his disease. We didn't know how much time he had. We didn't really have the details of his prognosis. My dad had an extremely rare type of melanoma cancer that originated in his rectum and then reached stage 4 metastasization, and it was a very rare subset of melanoma, so there's a lack of literature. And ultimately, during that first oncology session, he and my family over the phone were told that there's really not much we can do. He's eligible for immunotherapy, but there's no proof that this is going to work. So when my dad came back to the parking lot, he opened the door. He got inside. He was wearing a mask. Um, you know, he had to sit with this daunting news that he has this disease, and that there's a good chance he's not going to survive this. And I had to sit with that too. And I turned on the car and I began our drive home. And there was a moment of stillness. There was a moment of silence as the car hurtled along Bayview Avenue. And eventually I played our favorite song, which was Elias by Dispatch, and it was one of our favorite songs to listen on car rides, on long car rides. Uh, and it's this song written by Chadwick Stokes, who visited an area of Africa called Section 17, and it was one of the areas that was most highly infected with HIV in the early in the late 90s, early 2000s. And, he met a father named Elias there, and he wrote this song um, that was designated for Elias, but also for Elias's children, which the song is about. And it's a song about friendship, and it's about lifting yourself up when darkness looms over you. It's about family. It's about togetherness. And in this extremely difficult moment in our lives, I played that song and we listened, and you know, the percussions came in, and then the guitar joined the harmony. And as this song started playing, my dad started, drumming the glove compartment, and a smile fell on my face because I knew it was going to happen. And as we're driving along, suddenly we went from complete despair to belting out the chorus to our favorite song. And it was one of those moments where, you know, the weight of our circumstances seemed to dissolve. And it was just a moment of listening to our favorite song, of singing our favorite song side by side, father and son, driving down a road, not knowing what's going to happen down the line, but being happy for the moment that we currently had. And I think that's what end of life care is all about. You can't deny the inevitability of death, but you can embrace uh, you know the gift of the present. And that's what music does, that's what conversations do. And that's what my book's about. And it's all those bittersweet moments that do dovetail the despair, but make it a little bit easier to deal with.
Yeah, well, that's incredible because, you could have, as we were talking about before, this idea of what your father must have gone through, not really having people show up and it not being a time for sharing and talking and understanding the depth of the loss. I don't know what kind of conversations he had with his father when his mother died, but it doesn't seem like, he was really encouraged to have this,
Mhm.
kind of togetherness, this
Right.
kind of end of life care, the way you and your family made it happen,
Right.
COVID or not. It seems that all of you were trying to figure out what you needed to do and making sacrifices. And
Right.
I remember in the book you talk a little bit about your father um, advising you about sacrifices. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Okay, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, he said that life is a series of compromises.
Mhm.
And that could have meant a million things. And it's something that was obviously very apparent during a pandemic, when we had to sacrifice our lifestyles to come together, and you know sacrifice our sleep, and sacrifice so many aspects of our lives. uh you know my dad said those words to my sister, uh when there was this moment. Stephanie, at the time, her now fiance, or to her now husband, sorry, but at the time, she was dating her boyfriend at the time, Ryan, and he is a general surgeon. And Steph, previously, before she came to the house, she was working at a long-term care home. And because of that, they had to navigate all these, various degrees of potential exposure to the virus. And that's complicated when you have a loved one who's immunocompromised and who's very sick, and you don't want to further complicate things. And so there was the compromise of, Steph not being able to see, to see her boyfriend. And there was the fear of what that might mean for their relationship. And at a certain point, my dad said, listen, life is a series of compromises. And that also means making the time, for him as well. And not just for my father, but also for my sister's future husband. And, because of that, they were able to spend some time together. And, you know, that future husband, Ryan, he was there for my family in so many incredible ways, not just in terms of his medical expertise, but also just his emotional support. And that's something that we're forever going to be grateful for. And, you know, my dad said those lines a few weeks before Ryan eventually came into the home, and this was when we knew that my dad was going to die. It was actually the night before he was going to die. Uh, and, Ryan and Steph sat down on the edge of my father's bed, and Steph said, "Hey, Dad, me and Ryan, we're gonna get married one day." And my dad said, "That's beautiful. When that happens, if you choose to let that happen, You guys are different, and that's what makes you guys special. And he gave this beautiful speech about how, Stephanie's character can complement Ryan's character,
Mm.
and the promise of marriage. And when he was done talking, Ryan, who hadn't planned on doing this ahead of time, he looked Stephanie in the eyes, and he asked her to marry him. And then, afterwards, Stephanie raised that mask off Ryan's face, that mask that sort of symbolized all the hardships that all of us had to endure. And she kissed him on the lips, and it was this beautiful moment that my dad was fully aware of, and he got to witness. And it was right there. That was the accumulation of compromises. That was the accumulation of how life is a series of compromises, but it can take you to some incredible moments. And sometimes you just have to surrender to those compromises, and it can go both ways. Um, but yeah, I'm giving away all the details of my book, but that
Yeah.
was a big
No, I
moment.
mean it's
Yeah.
it's worth reading because it just the stories and the sweetness, and we barely really even scratched the surface of what was in there. But the reality is that it's really it's really, to me, a way of sharing with the world that you can face these difficult moments and find a way to do it the right way, and
Mhm.
that's not an easy thing to accomplish. And
Mhm.
I think that listeners can kind of carry some hope and recognition that if they're struggling with somebody who they know is unwell, that what is it going to take to actually stay connected during that time. And I think that's the biggest challenge, because we all kind of have this tendency to kind of shrink away from really painful things. And
Mhm.
this would be a really painful thing. Where do you think that you got the strength even, and what do you think gave your father the ability to share in ways that he wouldn't have before?
I think I read a lot. I read a lot of incredible books. One of my favorite books is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. There Tuesdays with Maury by Mitch Albom. And it's those are two books that talk about embracing despair, embracing difficulty, and finding meaning within the fear of death. You know, I think I gain a lot of strength from literature. I think that my father gains a lot of strength from family. When he lost both of his parents, he had his brother and his sister that lifted him up, and he had other difficulties after those. He lost his parents too, and it was always family togetherness that gave him his strength. And for me, that's definitely what I experienced too. My dad, because I did all these audio recordings, I was able to you know, play one of them after my father was buried. And in a way, he was able to do a speech um, after the funeral, after he was buried. And it spoke about transmission. He spoke about how, the love that his parents gave him was transmitted from him to me. And, there's countless interpretations of what that transmission could be. Uh, but I think it really just does come down to the devotion that his parents had for him, for the time that he had with them. It's something that he carried with him even after they were gone. And then he then was able to carry out that devotion to me and my sister. And there's something about that togetherness that can unify, that can give strength. I guess I know I'm giving a lot of various different answers to the question of where do we get the strength, and the answer is I don't really know. I think that it's because of family. I think it's because of the love that I was given throughout my childhood. I think it's because of the books that I've read. I think it's a lot of reasons. I would also say that these conversations that I had with my dad, they were more a result of fear than bravery. I would say that I was so afraid of losing him that I needed to capture him. And that fear is what, you know, surpassed uh any anxieties about having these difficult conversations. And I'm so glad that fear was there, because it pushed me to do what I think I really needed to.
That's really, really beautiful. I was really very close with my father, and he's not
Yeah.
alive any longer
Yeah.
either. And it's interesting listening to your story of wanting to capture your dad. And from my perspective, I kind of feel like my father's always with me because I was so close with him. Like, and he's not around anymore, but I kind of feel him
Yeah.
with me always. Do you have any of that? Given what you're just describing now?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, my dad, his moral compass was so strong, and he cared so much about helping people, and I feel like I carry his principles. I carry, his deep convictions about doing right and caring about people, and also his devotion to family. And that's the stuff that stays with me. That's the stuff that's, you know, I carry with me all the time. Um, and I'm gonna continue to carry with me forever. And I think one of the things that I was afraid of is that my future children, wouldn't know who their grandfather was. And, you know, by holding on to these stories, having these recordings, having this book, it offers them an opportunity to know him a little bit more than they would if I was just silent about it. Um, so yeah, I carry his convictions and I carry his memories, and I'm gonna continue doing that for as long as I can.
And now you carry his recordings too, so you'll
Yeah.
continue having those too.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard of the app called We Croak?
No. What's that?
It's this really interesting app that, during the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about, how do people deal with all this death? I mean, there was
Yeah.
so much death and it was so shocking, and people were going to the hospital and never coming out. And
Yeah.
it was just one of these times where there was so much uncertainty. And my
Yeah.
husband was also working at a hospital at the
Right.
time that this was all going on. And I was always aware that at any time he could come home with
Right.
COVID, and that we never knew what was going to happen because we both, I mean, he ended up getting um, the shot well before I did. I think I got mine like 8 months after he got his. Not because
Mm.
I didn't want it. It was just a matter of timing. I
Right.
wasn't given the opportunity. I was working full time at my clinic, but I wasn't. It just, those shots were hard to get.
Right.
Anyway, We Croak is this app, and it's got these quotes about life and death. And the one that I'm looking at right now is, if life must not be taken too seriously, then so neither must death. And that's by Samuel Butler. And then, if I
Wow.
turn the app off and on, it'll give me another quote. And, the app just kind of keeps showing up on my phone, with little, beeps, right? So I know that another quote has come up. So, I find it actually very reassuring to listen to
Yeah.
to read these quotes about death, because it does tend to put things that we think is so seriously in perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So it's actually kind of a interesting little app. And the other thing that I came across was actually an article in the Globe and Mail that was about these clubs that were meeting to have conversations about death. And what you said, I think, is really true, that we are in a culture that is very immature about death, and we don't tend to have these conversations. We don't tend to really sit with the truth and reality of the vulnerability of our existence,
Right.
and the reality of it. We really struggle with that in North America. We're very, very afraid of this idea. And it seems like, having given yourself the opportunity to have conversations like this, it probably brought you closer to that whole world, especially doing the volunteering that you did. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
About Camp Aaron?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was this incredible experience. My first summer doing it, I was in a cabin with four boys that between the ages of 5 and 7 who had all lost a father too. And when they first come to this camp, I don't think that when they're that young, they fully understand what's going on. You know, they know that it's this camp where they're there for a weekend. It's in this summer camp in Perry Sound, and you know they know that they're going to get to play basketball and run around and do all the things that kind of package the conventional summer camp experience, but they don't really know that the other boys in their cabin had experienced something similar. And I remember that it really clued in for them as well as a lot of the other kids in the camp during one of the first moments, which was we played this game called The North Wind Blows. And it's a very typical icebreaker game where a bunch of kids, the entire camp, and there's about 120 or 150 campers, they are scattered throughout the field, and along with all of the volunteers too, which are, you know, people 18 and up. And you know, there's the program director is in the middle of the field, and at first there's very gentle prompts. And the idea of the icebreaker is every time you agree with the statement, you got to run to a new spot in the circle. So the north wind blows if you love chocolate ice cream, and all the chocolate ice cream lovers will run to another spot. The north wind blows if you can't wait to do the polar bear dip in the morning, and then the next, you know, herd of campers would run to the other spot. But then eventually, you know, the prompts got a little bit more serious. The north wind blows if your mother died. And suddenly all of the campers that also had a mother die, you know, walk across the fields. And for the first moment, they're looking at other kids their age that had something so similar happen to them. And a lot of these kids, you know, they're not used to having any other kids, you know, in their classroom or you know, in their community that have also had a mother die so young in their life. And for the first time, they're looking at somebody else. And it's this incredible moment of eye contact where they see that they're not as alone as they previously thought they were. And then, you know, then the program director will then say the north wind blows if your father dies. And I remembered I was with my four boys and they all looked at me and they're like, "You too?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And we all, you know, one camper grabbed onto my back, another camper grabbed my hand, another one grabbed my arm, and we all walked to a new spot in that circle together, right? And you know, then the program director says, "The north wind blows if losing someone you love was really hard and scary, and sometimes you feel alone and afraid." And we all looked at each other, you know, our eyes said what words couldn't, and we moved to a new spot in the circle. And then the program director said, "Well, the north wind blows if having someone you love die is very scary, but that doesn't mean that you can't have fun and run around and be a kid." And you know, we all ran to a new spot, and that sort of kickstarted this dynamic experience of puddle jumping, right? Of having great moments interspersed with the sadness, and the sadness didn't disqualify the joy. In some ways, it just accentuated it. And so that's what this camp has to offer. You know, it has the space to talk about these difficult things, but also allowing kids to understand that you can jump in and out of those difficult feelings.
That is beautiful. Oh my goodness. What did that do for you to be with these four boys and to share that?
It took me out of my own grief, I think. You know, I did this a year after I lost my father, and you know, we had all these beautiful conversations sitting around the cabin where we all showed photos of our fathers. And you know, I think that it's it allowed me to understand how children process bereavement and what kids can teach adults about grief, right? And uh, yeah, you know, I definitely think that after I lost my father, I used writing as my therapy, and it was a way of taking control of the narrative, of adding agency to what I otherwise felt helpless towards. And I think there was probably some armor that I put on, and there was some distance between me and my own experience of grief. But seeing how quickly these kids can transition in and out of it, it allowed me to process my own grief, but also extend my grief outward. You know, when something bad happens to you, when you experience loss, it's very easy to feel like you're an anomaly, like you're the only person that's ever lost a father. And that's you know, it's comically untrue. And I think experiences like that it shows everybody the universality of grief. It shows the togetherness of grief. And when you lean into that togetherness, you know, beautiful moments can emerge.
Hmm. It sounds like Camp Aaron was for you too.
Yeah. Oh, it was for all the volunteers too. You know, it was all
Was
of the
that a
volunteers.
universal experience with the volunteers that they often had lost somebody?
The majority of them have lost somebody. Yes.
Hmm. How
I
do
was
people find,
so
so go ahead.
no, what were you gonna say?
How do people find out about Camp Aaron?
So there is a website registration. You can Google Camp Aaron Toronto. I don't know the exact URL. I can give that to you afterwards though. Um, and I'm pretty sure registration might have closed for the summer, but um, there's there is a website. It's created by the Aluna Network, which there's a former MLB pitcher named Jamie Moyer, and he founded this Camp Aaron, this organization, based on somebody that he met through the Make a Wish Foundation. Her name was Erin Metcalf. She had lung cancer in the 90s when she was 16 years old, and she expressed, her concern for her siblings and for the other people visiting the hospital after she died. And after she died, Jamie and his wife, Karen, they created a camp for kids to go to and experience, the dynamic, turmoil of grief within the context of a summer camp where they get to also be kids. And now, as I said, there's a Camp Aaron in every city that has a major league baseball team. So it's a really incredible opportunity for so many kids.
Wow, that
Yeah.
that is a good place for us to wind down, and
Yeah.
we'll make sure that Camp Aaron links get posted
Yeah.
to the blog post that we have as well.
Yeah.
I'm really glad to hear about it. And just before we wrap up,
Yeah.
I want to know if there's anything that I should have asked you, Mitchell, or anything that our listeners might be interested in. And, I'll just let you know that we have, usually between 3,500 and 4,200 live listeners. So, there's a lot of people who are interested in this.
Well, I guess what I would say about my book Home Safe is that it's a story about sadness and grief, but more than anything, it's about the joy that can emerge within end of life care. And I know that it's daunting, and I know that there's so many various experiences of grief and loss. And the reality is that not everybody gets the opportunity to have these final conversations and lean into this extremely difficult dialogue. But what I'll, emphasize once again is that we don't have to wait until a loved one is dying to have these really difficult conversations. We can have them before, and we can lean into this really difficult dialogue and find relief in togetherness. And I think that's what my book tries to convey more than anything. Um, and that's what me as a journalist, that's what I care about telling people. And it's not easy. Grief is a dynamic experience, and there's no easy categorization for it. Uh, but it's also an incredibly beautiful experience, and it can bring you together with so many loved ones. It can make your pain feel more expansive, and it can open up some incredible moments.
That's really beautiful. Thank you so much for joining us, Mitchell. I'm just going to say again, if people are interested in Home Safe, a memoir of end-of-life care during COVID-19 by Mitchell Consky, and I will post some of these other links so that people who are interested can listen. And to our listeners, I wish you have a gentle day, and maybe take up a little bit of writing if you're going through something tough. Thank you for joining us, Mitchell.
Thank you so much for having me.